Is it ever too late to change? That's a question people have been asking for as long as humans have been around. And honestly, depending on who you ask, you might get a very different answer. Some people will tell you that once you hit a certain age, that's it. The die is cast. You are who you are. Others will say the opposite. That change is always possible. That it's never too late to start over. But here's the thing. Both sides might be missing something important, because the real answer lives somewhere in the middle, and it's a lot more interesting than either extreme. Let's start with something wild. Did you know that your brain never actually stops changing? Scientists used to believe that after childhood, the brain was basically fixed, done, finished, like concrete that had already dried. They called this idea neural determinism, and for a long time it was treated almost like a law of nature. But then research started poking holes in that idea. Big ones. It turns out the brain has something called neuroplasticity, which is just a fancy way of saying it can rewire itself throughout your entire life. New habits, new skills, new ways of thinking. The brain physically restructures to accommodate them. People who learned instruments in their 70s showed measurable changes in brain structure. Stroke survivors relearned how to walk and talk using completely different neural pathways. This is not motivational fluff. This is actual neuroscience. So right away, the idea that change is biologically impossible after a certain age falls completely apart. But let's talk about some of the more dramatic theories people have about change. Because there are some genuinely strange ones floating around out there. One popular belief is that your personality is locked in by the time you turn 25. Fully formed. Sealed. Done. The claim usually traces back to studies on the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of your brain involved in decision-making and impulse control. It does finish developing around that age. But here is where the conspiracy version of this idea goes off the rails. Some people take that fact and turn it into something much darker. They say corporations and governments know this, and they deliberately design education systems, media, and even food to lock people into certain mindsets before that window closes. The idea being that a compliant, uncurious adult population is easier to manage than one full of people who question everything. Look, there is a version of that critique that has some truth to it. Systems can absolutely be designed in ways that discourage critical thinking. But the leap from that to a coordinated plot, to biologically freeze your personality, that is where the evidence disappears entirely. And more importantly, even if your prefrontal cortex is fully developed, that does not mean your values, your beliefs, or your habits are frozen solid. People leave religions they were raised in. People leave abusive relationships after decades. People quit addictions after 30 years. The brain is not a locked vault. It is more like a living river that carves new channels when the water moves differently. Another popular theory worth mentioning is the idea that self-help and personal development are themselves a kind of conspiracy. The argument goes something like this. By convincing people they just need to change themselves, society distracts them from changing the systems around them. And again, there is a kernel of genuine insight buried in there. Structural problems do require structural solutions, but the conclusion that personal change is therefore useless or even a trap, that is throwing out something genuinely valuable along with the bathwater, because the two things are not mutually exclusive. You can work on yourself and care about bigger systemic issues at the same time. They actually tend to reinforce each other. People who develop discipline, empathy, and resilience tend to be better advocates for change in the world around them too. Now, one of the more emotionally compelling arguments against change comes from a different place entirely. Not conspiracy, but personal experience. A lot of people genuinely believe they have tried to change and failed so many times that the possibility itself has become exhausting. And that feeling is real. It deserves to be taken seriously and not dismissed with a motivational poster slogan. Because here, is something that does not get talked about enough. Most people who try to change do not fail because they are weak. They fail because they are using the wrong model of change entirely. The dominant cultural narrative goes something like this. You decide to change. You summon willpower. You push through. You succeed. And if you fail, it means you did not want it badly enough, that you are fundamentally flawed in some deep way. That model is not just unhelpful, it is genuinely harmful. And a lot of researchers have been saying so for years, because willpower is not a personality trait, it is a resource. And like any resource, it runs out. Studies have repeatedly shown that people make worse decisions as the day goes on, not because they become worse people, but because decision-making draws from a limited pool of cognitive energy. So if you are trying to change a habit through sheer force of will, you are essentially trying to win a long race by sprinting the entire way. The people who change successfully are not usually the ones with the most willpower. They are the ones who design their environment so that the right choice becomes the easiest one. They remove friction from the behaviors they want and add friction to the ones they do not. They build systems instead of relying on motivation. Because motivation is a feeling, and feelings come and go. There is also the question of identity, and this one is fascinating. Researchers who study behavior change have found that one of the most powerful predictors of lasting change is whether a person changes their self-image, not just their actions. In other words, it is not enough to say, "I am trying to quit smoking." The shift that tends to stick is "I am not a smoker." That might sound like a small semantic difference, but psychologically, it is enormous, because when your identity changes, your decisions start flowing from that new identity almost automatically. You do not have to fight yourself every time. You are just acting consistently with who you believe you are. And here is the really hopeful part. That kind of identity shift can happen at any age, in any circumstance, after any number of previous failures. It does not require a perfect past. It does not require a certain kind of upbringing or a particular level of education. It just requires the willingness to begin telling yourself a slightly different story about who you are. Now, there is something almost poetic about the geological timescale of change when you think about it this way. The continents are moving right now, just a few millimeters per year. Barely perceptible. Yet over millions of years, those tiny shifts have completely reshaped the face of the planet. The same principle applies to human beings. You do not need dramatic, explosive transformation. You need consistent, directional movement. Even tiny, even slow, even imperfect. Because the question is never really whether change is possible. The science is pretty clear on that front. The real question is whether you are willing to take the first step, even if you have taken it before and stumbled, even if people around you are skeptical, even if some part of you is skeptical too. Because every system on this planet, every ecosystem, every geological formation, every star we can observe, is in a constant state of becoming. Nothing in the universe is truly static. Not the mountains, not the ocean floor, not the magnetic poles, and certainly not you. So if you are sitting with the weight of something you want to change about your life, something you have been putting off, something you have been told is too late for, here is what the evidence actually says. It is not too late. And the timing is never going to feel perfect. The window does not close at 25 or 45 or 65. The brain keeps adapting. The world keeps offering new starting points. The only thing that can actually close the window is the decision to stop looking through it. So maybe the most important question is not whether it is too late to change. Maybe the better question is, what is one small thing you could do differently tomorrow? Just one. Just small. Just enough to point yourself in a new direction. Because that is how rivers carve canyons. Not all at once, but one drop at a time, over and over again, without giving up. And that kind of quiet, persistent movement, that is what reshapes worlds. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel.